Module 8, Political and Social Philosophy, Lecture 8A, What is Justice? What is justice? One of the oldest and most influential ideas in human history is the importance of justice. The 5 books of Moses teaches, justice, justice shall you pursue, Deuteronomy 16:20. The prophet Amos teaches, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, Amos 5:24. The preamble of the United States Constitution begins with the government's responsibility to establish justice. And Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But what precisely is justice? It is an important term that's very difficult to pin down. Perhaps the most ambitious attempt to define justice was in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, which many consider his greatest work. This book contains the famous story of the Ring of Gyges. We talked about that already. It also contains Plato's allegory of the cave. But the heart of the book is an attempt to define an ideal state based on principles of justice. Plato was reacting to what he considered the injustice and corruption of the city-state of Athens. After all, this was the government that had executed his mentor, Socrates. The book begins with Socrates, who represents Plato's position in dialogue with various leaders of the Athenian community on the meaning of justice. He first encounters Cephalus, an older aristocratic statesman. Cephalus presents a traditional view of justice as speaking the truth and paying one's debt. Socrates brings a classical challenge. If someone borrows a weapon, is it justice to return it to the owner? What if the person wants the weapon back to kill an innocent person? Obviously, justice is not simply paying debts, or else we won't return the weapon. If such payment leads to an unjust situation. Polemarchus, the son of Cephalus, builds on his father's point of view. Justice is seeking the good of one's friends and the harm of one's enemies. Socrates responds that it is not always clear who is a friend and who is an enemy. Thrasymachus then gives a more radical view of justice. Justice is whatever the strong and those in power desire. This definition is very close to ethical egoism, which we studied in the previous module. It is the strong who define what justice is. This reflects the view of Socrates' bitter enemies, the sophists, who taught that there are no universal standards of justice. Man is the measure of all things. Justice is man-made, and the strong have the ability to set standards of justice. Socrates responds that justice requires people who are superior in character and intelligence, not simply in power. At this point, Plato's brother Glaucon presents the story of Gyges and the ring that makes him invisible. We talked about that. His point is that people will do whatever they can get away with for their own self-fulfillment. Earlier, we called this psychological egoism. For Glaucon, people band together to form governments which prevent people from hurting other people. In a sense, Glaucon saw justice as a social contract, an idea later developed by Thomas Hobbes. We will get in the next lecture to the idea of a social contract. Finally, Plato presents through the mouth of Socrates his own view of justice. Justice in the city is parallel to justice within the human psyche. Justice is not something external but internal. He uses the image of a human solar psyche for a model of how justice in the city-state should work. Plato describes a tripartite vision of the human soul. The 3 parts are reason, spirit, and appetite. The reason needs to be controlled by wisdom. The spirit needs to be controlled by courage. The appetites need to be controlled by temperance. When these 3 parts of the human soul are in balance, that is justice. Thus we arrive at Plato's 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Plato sometimes pictured this as a chariot driver controlling two horses. The driver is reason and the horses are spirit and appetite. When they are in balance, that is justice. Thought question. Like Plato, Sigmund Freud also envisions a tripartite vision of the soul. The id is the inner drive, such as anger and sex. The superego is the rules set down by parents and civilization. And the ego is the self, attempting to control these other two. Also like a chariot driver, but much less in control with Freud than with Plato. Do you believe that Freud was influenced by Plato? Now we turn to the brilliant insight of Plato. The ideal state is analogous to the human psyche. The state is run by philosopher kings who represent wisdom. The guardians of the state, the military and the police, are analogous to spirit. They must display courage. The farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, and ordinary workers are analogous to the appetite. They must display temperance and self-discipline. And when each of these groups play their respective roles and keep a balance, this is justice. Justice is the balanced functioning of the state by everyone performing their roles. I tried to show a picture there of a philosopher king in charge. That's not Freud, that's a philosopher king. Plato developed some radical ideas for his time about the leaders of the state, the philosopher kings. First, they also include philosopher queens. The role was open to women who were considered worthy. Second, philosopher kings and queens could not have families of their own. They did not marry. They could be chosen to have children, but the children were raised communally. Those in positions of leadership should not be distracted by family responsibilities. Finally, only those children trained in mathematics as well as philosophy were chosen to be philosopher kings. Plato envisions a true aristocracy. He had no use for democracy, which he considered mob rule. After all, it was democracy that had killed Socrates. Aristotle, who built on Plato. Aristotle, in his book Politics, divided various forms of government. He divided governments into 6 categories. Rule by one is a monarchy, which can degenerate into a tyranny. Ideally, the monarchy rules in the interests of his subjects, but too often such a monarch is only concerned with his or her own power. Rule by a few is an aristocracy, which can degenerate into an oligarchy. In an aristocracy, only the best rule according to virtue. This can degenerate into the rich ruling to maintain their own power. An aristocracy was Aristotle's favorite form of government. Rule by the many is called a polity, which involves both the rich and poor ruling for the greater good, but this can degenerate into democracy, which Aristotle, like Plato, saw as mob rule. Below is a chart of Aristotle's 6 forms of government. The one, the few, the many, the monarchy and tyranny, the aristocracy and oligarchy, the polity and democracy. Notice that neither Plato nor Aristotle believed in democracy. Punishment is justice. When we consider justice, we often look at punishment. We say that criminals deserve justice for their crimes. And this raises the question as to the purpose of punishment. Should people who use illegal drugs be punished? Is true rehabilitation ever possible? Ethicists see various reasons for punishment. Retributive justice. This philosophy teaches that when someone commits a crime, they deserve a punishment commensurate with that crime. They deserve punishments. Such a punishment often goes by the Latin phrase lex talionis, based on the idea an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as taught in the Bible. One should thought that lex talionis was already more liberal than the Hammurabi Code, where if someone kills someone else's son, the other can kill that person's son. Later Jewish law would say that an eye for an eye was never meant to be taken literally, but signifies money. Today, many people question retributive justice as pure revenge that serves no moral purpose. If we are to punish people, it must be for some other purpose or some other reasons. Restorative justice. This philosophy attempts to restore the situation before the crime took place through reconciliation between the perpetrator and the criminal. In a financial crime such as stealing, it would involve paying back money that is owed. It also seeks rehabilitation and dialogue between all parties in a crime. Obviously, restorative justice is very difficult to implement following crimes of murder, rape, or severe bodily harm. But some have argued even in these cases that there's room for a dialogue between the perpetrator and the victim, perhaps leading to forgiveness. Punishment as deterrence. This is a utilitarian principle advocated by John Rawls and many others. The purpose of justice is to increase the amount of good in society by preventing this particular crime from happening in the future. By locking up a criminal, that criminal is prevented from repeating that crime. The hope is that others will see the punishment and will be dissuaded from ever committing similar crimes. Here we're not concerned with the effect on the criminal, but rather on society as a whole. Remember that utilitarianism is we want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Finally, we come to the most modern approach. Punishment is rehabilitation. This teaches that the purpose of punishment is to change the criminal so they become a different person, unlikely to commit similar crimes. This theory of punishment is becoming more and more popular today. The argument is that retribution as a source of punishment serves no moral purpose, whereas rehabilitation has the potential to create a new person who could benefit society. Many people in prison earn high school or college degrees, learn skills to use in the workplace or find religion. They come out as better people. And obviously, many of the people who believe in punishment as rehabilitation are opposed to capital punishment. Looking at capital punishment through the eyes of these four approaches, I think, is a wonderful project. So we will continue with more about justice in the next lecture.